Good evening and welcome to Mining the Riches of the Parsha. Tonight is Thursday night, August 24th, 2023. I missed you last week and I am thrilled to be back together with you this week at the new time, 8 p.m., which we're going to stick with for the next few weeks until near the end of September. We return back to 7 p.m., but meanwhile we're at 8 p.m. Welcome and thank you very much for joining. Lo sira es chamar achicha o shoro. It should not happen, the Torah tells us in our portion, the Parsha of Teitzei, it should not happen that you see the donkey of your fellow or his ox, noflim baderach, they fell down, they were carrying a load, and the animal fell down, v'hisalamta mehem, and you ignore them. That is, don't ever let it happen that somebody else's animal fell over and the burden also fell over and you're going to ignore them and not help them. Don't ever do that. Rather, hakem takim imo. Help the owner of the animal pick the animal up and put the burden back. You see someone in need, you help them. Okay, so today maybe it's not a donkey or an ox. Maybe it's a car or a bicycle. You see someone and they broke down on the side. Don't just ignore them. Don't leave them there. Connect to them. Help them. Make sure that they're okay. So it's a very important mitzvah. It is the repetition of a mitzvah that was already mentioned earlier in the Torah, in the book of Shmos and the Parsha Mishpatim, which is not unusual because we're now in the middle of the book of Devarim, the fifth book of the Torah. And remember, I shared with you before, one of the names of this book, besides Devarim, besides Deuteronomy, is Mishneh Torah, because it is largely a Mishneh Torah, a restatement of the first four books of the Torah. Moshe's speeches at the end of his life before the Jews are about to go into Israel, and Moshe is giving them warnings and lessons and history reminders, what they're going to need in order to go into Israel and create this new society. And in the course of that, he repeats a lot of the mitzvos that have been repeated before. So a lot of the mitzvos that we saw and learned early in the Torah are repeated. And this mitzvah, don't ignore when your fellow has an animal and the load falls. Don't ignore it, but help him out. It's a repetition of an earlier mitzvah in the Torah. However, this repetition has a significant change from the original. One word that it's curious that this word should be changed. Let's go back to the original. Back in the book of Shmos, in the Parsha Mishpatim, the Torah says as follows, Ki sireh chamor sonacha, when you see the donkey of your enemy, rovetz tachas masa'o, the donkey is struggling under its load, and it's about to fall over, v'chadalta me'azov lo, azov tazov imo. Don't let the burden fall down. Don't let the animal fall down. Work together with the owner to pick the animal up, to right the burden so that nothing falls down. Same idea. But here, in the first time in Shemos, the Torah says when you see the donkey that belongs to your enemy, of course, it doesn't mean only your enemy. If it was your friend, you would let them ignore them. Obviously, it means even if it's your enemy, still you should help them. It's an amazing mitzvah. It's an amazing lesson. Even if it's your enemy, but if they're in trouble and you could help them, you should still help them. So why is it that earlier in the Torah, the idea is mentioned to apply even if it's your enemy, but here in our Parsha, the wording is changed if you see this happen to your fellow, to your friend. Why not even your enemy? Why the change? So I want to share with you a classic answer of Rabbi Meir Simchah of Dvinsk in his classic commentary to the Torah, Meshech Chochmah. And Rabbi Meir Simchah explains that the difference in wording is due to the difference between when the mitzvah was taught. The first time it was taught in the Parsha Mishpatim. It was taught before the incident of the Egel, the golden calf. Before the incident of the golden calf, the Jewish people as a whole were pious, righteous people. And if someone would have done something wrong, committed a sin, it would be natural for others to look down on that person because it was so unusual. Everyone was on such a high level of spirituality and morality. Had one person sinned, it would be understandable and natural to look down on that person and to even call them enemy, a sonne, an enemy, one that we do not care for. This is only before the sin of the golden calf. When God says about the Jewish people at Mount Sinai that the entire Jewish people is Mamleches Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh, a nation of priests and a people that is holy. But after the sin of the golden calf, it's not like that anymore. That sin and others that followed, most of the Jewish people succumbed to sin. And therefore, im yira adam machavero chet, if one person sees, oh, that fellow did a sin, don't criticize him. Because im yefashvesh b'masav, because if you just look inside yourself, yimsa kama michsholim, you'll find plenty of faults within yourself. If everyone is on such a high level and one person has done something wrong, okay, that person is on a lower level. But once everybody has sinned, then to criticize somebody for sinning, you'd be a hypocrite. Because, Nebuch, you, I don't mean you, not you personally, but other people also have sinned. L'chein asur lisno ish kazeh. And therefore you should never look down on a person because they committed a sin. Because I also commit sins. Who am I to judge another person? And we are certainly no better than that person because he has his faults, she has her faults, they have their faults, I have my faults. And now, after so many of us have sinned, kasha limso kamoso, valze amru ra'isi b'nei aliyah v'hema muatim. To find someone who is without sin, that's rare. Before the sin of the golden calf, it was common. But later, by the end of the 40 years in the desert, when this repetition of the mitzvahs is happening, don't be a hypocrite. Don't judge other people. They're no enemies. They're no sinners. There's just fellows. There's just friends. And we all have our pekalach. We all have our shortcomings. That's what Rabbi Meir Simcha Dvinsk says to explain the difference in wording between the two verses. Now, listen to the consequence of this idea for us right now. We find ourselves in the month of Elul. We're only 3 weeks before Rosh Hashanah. This is a time of introspection. It's a time when I should be thinking about what have I done, what do I need to correct, where do I want to go, who do I want to be. And it means that I have to look at myself. I have to look at myself with honesty and see things that I really might not want to see, but if I'm going to be honest, I have to see them. if I'm going to look at myself honestly and see the faults within myself, what we learn from Rabbi Meir Simchah of Dvinsk is that necessarily must also color how we look at others. If I'm looking at myself and seeing my own shortcomings, I'm certainly not going to look at somebody else and think of their shortcomings. Who am I to judge them? If we are not looking at others now more favorably than we otherwise would, if we are not more willing to overlook the trespasses and the shortcomings of others now, it means that there's something wrong with our introspection of ourselves. Because the Torah is teaching us by this change in language that introspection of myself should cause me to be more understanding and more forgiving of others. As I contemplate the mistakes I have made, I certainly have no right to look at another and to think poorly of them due to their sins. But rather, I have to look at another as achicha, my fellow, my friend. We all need to improve. And that means I've got to look at you more favorably, with the benefit of the doubt. Never ever looking down on someone else, because we're brothers, we're sisters, we're fellows, we're in this together. We're all trying in our own way to overcome struggles and obstacles in life. And this lesson of the switch of words should imbue us with a different attitude, in these days especially, towards everyone else who is, as we are, imperfect. So we're near the end of August. Schools in many parts of the world are beginning the new school year. In Jewish schools all over the world, Jewish children are starting for the first time to study Torah. And in many parts of the Jewish world, when a child begins to study Torah, it's a celebration. And there are, in many places, there are parties and there are candies, and often with parents and grandparents beaming and taking photos of their child beginning the process of studying Torah. Because we hope that the child's connection to Torah will be deep and long and joyous, and most importantly, formative. So, a lot of thought goes into what is the first book of the Torah that we teach a Jewish child? What is the first subject that is taught to start this relationship between a Jewish child and what we hope will be a lifelong study of Torah? Where do we start? Well, different communities in different eras have different choices, a number of different traditional choices, each one of them with some profound basis. But in many places, the first passage of Talmud that a Jewish child studies, when a Jewish child is introduced, reaches the level, the age, is introduced to the study of Talmud, the first passage of Talmud that is taught is the second chapter of the tractate Baba Metzia, the chapter that is called Elu Metzios. Elu Metzios. Now, that's a curious place to start because Baba Metzia, the tractate, the volume, is not at the beginning of the Talmud, it's in the middle. And the chapter is not at the beginning of the tractate. It's the second chapter. So why start there? Why start with the second chapter of a middle volume? This chapter is an expansion of the mitzvah in our Torah portion this week, the Parsha of Teitzei, of HaShovat Aveidah, to try to return a lost object to its rightful owner. This is the passage just before the verse that I quoted a few moments ago. The Torah says as follows: Lo sireh shor achicha o eseyo nidachim v'salamta mehem hashev teshivem lachicha. Don't let it happen that you see the ox of your fellow or the sheep of your fellow which is lost and ignore that. Don't do that. Rather, return the lost animal to its rightful owner. And the Torah says, V'im lo karav achicha elecha. What if you don't know who the owner is? You found an object, someone lost it, and you don't know to whom it belongs? Well, take it into your house and go through some kind of process to find the rightful owner. And it doesn't only apply to an ox or a sheep, it applies to anything. Anytime we find an object which is clearly lost by somebody, we should try to return it to its rightful owner. Lo sucha lehisalem, do not ignore it. Don't pretend, as Rashi says, don't pretend you didn't see it. Rather, if there's a lost object that you come upon, try to return it to its rightful owner. That's the mitzvah of HaShovat Aveidah. And there are at least two reasons we want this subject of returning a lost object imprinted on the heart of every Jew from the very beginning of their Jewish education, which is the reason we start with this chapter. First reason is as follows. This mitzvah, that we are obligated, if we come upon an object that someone lost, to do our best to try to return it to its rightful owner if that's possible. This mitzvah is a profound message about God, to whom the world belongs, and our place in the world. If I come upon a lost object, let's say there's nobody else around, I do not have the right just to pick it up and take it for myself. We are not entitled to whatever we find, to whatever we can take, even if no one else will know. This message is so important, it was actually the first commandment God gave to Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava in the Garden of Eden. God said to them, I've given you this beautiful world, this beautiful garden. There's so much for you to enjoy, except for one tree. The fruit of one tree, you can't have it. Not everything is permitted to you. There's something that's off limits. There's plenty to enjoy, but there is something that you cannot take. So HaShovat Aveidah, returning a lost object, means that we try to find the owner. If it's necessary, we go to other lengths to try to identify the correct owner. And this helps to create a constant reminder that God is with us through life. Our actions should reflect God's presence in our lives at every moment. I don't get to take whatever I could take. By realizing not everything we can take, may we take, Hashev teshivem lachicha, but rather do your best to return it to its rightful owner. That's one reason. A second reason that this subject is so foundational that it is often the first Jewish Talmudic topic a Jewish child begins with is because this mitzvah of HaShovat Aveidah, returning a lost object, helps to create the refinement of character that God wants us to have. So I want to share with you an amazing story. When I shared this story before, I learned that there is another version of it, but I'm going to share with you the version of the story that I heard from Rabbi Pesach Krohn. And the story goes like this. True story. You may know that Samuel Reichman and the Reichman family had great wealth before World War II. When World War II broke out, Samuel Reichman was stuck in Hungary. Now, at that time, it was against the law to send money to the United States or Canada. And if he would be caught, he would be severely punished. So here's what he did. He took his fortune and he purchased cashier's checks for large sums. A number of checks, each one was made out to cash for $75,000. In those days, that was money. His name was not on the check. It just said, pay the bearer 75,000 US dollars. And he sent the checks to different Jewish businessmen in New York. One of the men who received a check was a man named Charles Bendheim. He was a wealthy Jewish businessman in New York. When I lived in Riverdale, New York, in the late 1970s, I knew members of the Bendheim family, and I learned about Charles, who was the patriarch of this amazing, incredible family, the Bendheim family. So, Charles Bendheim, in his office, he receives a cashier's check in the mail, $75,000, no name, no return address, no indication of who it's for or what it's for, but it's post-dated. The envelope is post-dated from Hungary. Well, Charles Bendheim has no idea who sent him this check or why it was sent to him, but he does know there's no reason for it to belong to him. There's no one who owes him this money that would pay in such a manner. So he takes the check and he puts it away in a safe. And nothing happened after that. Nothing happened for 5 years. 5 years later, Samuel Reichman makes it to America, and he comes to the office of Charles Bendheim in New York. They did not know each other. But Samuel said to Charles, I'm the one that sent you that check 5 years ago for $75,000, and I can identify it because this is the number on the check. He was able to identify that he was the one that sent it. And Charles immediately took the check out of the safe and gave it to Samuel. Reichman did this with several people. Every one of them gave it back to him. And that is how the Reichman family was able to reassemble their wealth after World War II. HaShovat Aveidah, returning an object to its rightful owner, it's not just a mitzvah, a commandment. It is a mitzvah that builds a special kind of character. And that's why children start with it. And that is why each one of us should study this subject as well. But there's an even more profound and transformative aspect of this mitzvah that I want to share with you. We've discussed this in the past, that our sages in many different places in Talmudic writing have various statements that are some version of Zeh klal gadol b'Torah. This is the most important principle of the Torah. This is the most fundamental principle, the most important principle, the most unifying principle of the entire Torah. Okay, sometimes it's phrased a little bit differently, but there are different opinions about what is the single most important, foundational, unifying principle of the entire Torah. And we have discussed a number of these opinions in the past. Emanuel Levinas, the Jewish philosopher, used to say, in his opinion, the greatest Jewish principle was the simple phrase, after you. I think that has a lot of merit. I think a person could do very well to live their Jewish life by that principle. After you. But let me suggest another, which comes from the mitzvah of HaShovat Aveidah, returning a lost object, in our Torah portion. Because in our Torah portion, in the passage that I read to you, we have 3 Hebrew words. And these 3 Hebrew words are a motto for a meaningful Jewish life. A very good candidate for Zeh klal gadol b'Torah, the greatest principle in the Torah. So again, if you see an animal or an object that belongs to your fellow and they lost it, don't ignore it. Return it to its rightful owner. Lo suchal lehis aleim. You will not be able to ignore it. Rashi says, you will not be able to turn your eyes like this. You close your eyes. I'm walking down the street and I hold my eyes like this. So I didn't see that object over there. So if I didn't see it, of course, I don't have an obligation to pick it up and have to go to the trouble to return it to its rightful owner. I didn't see it. I didn't see it. Torah says don't do that. But notice, please, the wording. The Torah does not say, do not ignore the lost object. The Torah does not say, it's not nice to ignore the lost object. The Torah says, lo suchal lehis aleim. You will not be able to ignore that object. Now, that wording is very strange. Rabbi Michael Yammer is the head of the Yeshivat Shalavim in Israel. And on the first day of class in his yeshiva one year, he addressed his students by quoting these words. And he said that those 3 words, lo suchal lehis aleim, those 3 words are the motto, the foundation for a meaningful Torah life. And he explained it as follows. What does the Torah mean? You will not be able to ignore it. Of course, if I want to ignore it, I could ignore it. Again, the Torah didn't say don't ignore it. The Torah didn't say it's nasty to ignore it. It would be nice if you did not ignore it. The Torah says you will not be able to. It's very strange because, the way language works, yes, I can. I'm perfectly able to ignore a lost object and not return it. But what the Torah is telling us is that the goal is to develop yourself, to educate yourself so that you will simply be incapable of ignoring the opportunity to return a lost object. In other words, the Torah wants us to do mitzvot. God wants us to observe God's commandments. Yes. But much deeper than that, it's not just that God wants us to do certain actions or to not do certain actions. God wants us to change our character. The goal of every single mitzvah is not just to do the mitzvah. Yes, of course, that is a goal. But the ultimate goal is not just the performance of that action, but the refinement of our character to make the values of wanting to do that action a part of ourselves. The goal is to instill a mitzvah mentality within us so that observing a mitzvah is an inseparable aspect of our personality, to the point where we are unable, for example, to ignore a lost object. Ultimately, through this process of personality and character development, you will become a changed person. And that is God's goal for us. And of course, our sages explain this does not apply exclusively to a lost physical object. There are spiritual losses also. There are spiritual losses that all of us are in the process of retrieving. It needs to be part of our nature that we are incapable of ignoring a lost spiritual potential in ourselves as well as in others. And our commentators further explain that these three words, lo sucha lihisaleim, this expression is not only associated with a lost object, either physical or spiritual. The phrase applies to everything that requires rectification that we see around us. These three words, lo sucha lihisaleim, you are not capable of ignoring. This is a command to notice what needs to be fixed and where we can help others. We need to look around all the time. Notice everything from a lost object to an injustice, and make sure that nothing needing to be fixed, rectified, or improved is ever ignored. To be incapable of that, to be incapable of not helping someone else so that it is so deeply ingrained and intertwined into our character. This should be the motto of our lives for every mitzvah. Lo sucha lihisaleim. It's not just that we do the action, we are incapable of not doing what God wants us to do. That's the character that we are to develop. But allow me to add one last spiritual aspect to this mitzvah of HaShovat Aveidah. Okay, there's a mitzvah HaShovat Aveidah. You find something in the street, you should pick it up, take care of it, try to find the owner, return it to its rightful owner. That's the mitzvah of HaShovat Aveidah. And there are details in the Talmud and in the codes of Jewish law of exactly how to go about finding the owner. The Rambam Maimonides writes as follows: one who finds a lost object that obligates him to return it must announce that he has found such an item and call upon anyone who has lost an object of this type to come and give identifying marks and then claim it. That's based on the Talmud. Now he goes further. Where and how does someone make such an announcement? The Rambam writes, Maimonides writes further. Originally, anyone who found a lost object would announce the object for 3 consecutive festivals. Remember, during the time that the Beit HaMikdash was standing, the Holy Temple was standing in Jerusalem, it was a mitzvah for every single Jewish person to come to Jerusalem to celebrate Pesach and Shavuos and Sukkot together. Everyone in Jerusalem would gather Aliyah L'Regel. So that means that every single Jewish person was there 3 times a year. When a person came to the Beit HaMikdash for the 3 festivals, there was a special spot near the temple. People would stand on that spot, it was a known spot, and announce whatever they had found. It's like the lost and found department, and it was known. So the entire Jewish people was there, and there's a very good chance that the person that lost it would be there. So you go to the spot, you announce, I found such and so. If you can give me the identifying remark, I'll return it to you. It's a very good system in ancient times for trying to find the owner of a lost object. The Rambam writes further, Umishachara Beis HaMikdash, but when the temple was destroyed, and we no longer had this gathering of every single Jew to Jerusalem 3 times a year, the rabbis enacted that a person should make announcements in the local synagogue, in the local study hall. Okay, what will we do today? Facebook. We would post it. That's how we return lost objects today. Okay, now, I want to share with you an insight. It's quite subtle and it's textual, but I hope you'll agree it's an incredible insight. Mishachar Beis HaMikdash. Once the temple was destroyed, okay, so we have to have an alternative way of announcing a lost object to try to find the rightful owner. Mishachar Beis HaMikdash. Once the temple was destroyed. If you do a word search in the entire Talmud for the expression Mishachar Beis HaMikdash, when the temple was destroyed, so and so, such and such. If you do a word search, you will find that that phrase, Mishachar Beis HaMikdash, is mentioned 15 times in the Talmud. 15 times in the entire Talmud, the words Mishachar Beis HaMikdash, when the temple was destroyed, and usually it is in the context of legislation. When the temple was destroyed, the rabbis, in light of the new reality, legislated such and such a rule. And there's rules about the holidays and rules about other things, all kinds of different rules. Mishachar Beis HaMikdash, the legislation was, once the temple was destroyed, in light of the change of reality, Jews are no longer gathering in Jerusalem, the Jews are now in exile. Mishachar Beis HaMikdash, all kinds of new legislation, 15 times. I'm not going to quote all 15 instances. I'm just going to quote one. Because there's one of the 15 where the phrase Mishachar Beis HaMikdash, when the temple was destroyed, and there's a piece of legislation from a certain rabbi, where there's a difference in the language. And this one place out of the entire Talmud is in Baba Metzia, the tractate of Baba Metzia, the 2nd chapter, Ela Metzias, in connection with the laws of a lost object. So the Talmud says as follows. The Talmud says, and this is the source of what the Rambam Maimonides later wrote in his code. The Talmud says as follows. Originally, meaning earlier when the temple was still standing, whoever found a lost object would bring it to the Beis HaMikdash, the holy temple in Jerusalem, and stand at the spot where people would come if they had lost something and announce it. Umishachara Beis HaMikdash. But when the temple was destroyed, Sheyibane bimheira biyamenu, and may it be speedily rebuilt in our days. The rabbis enacted that you should now make the announcement for lost objects in the synagogues and the study halls of your town. Let's understand that every word of the Talmud is written with precision and with conscious intent. If there are 15 places where there's legislation as a result of the temple being destroyed, and 14 of those times there's no prayer associated with the rebuilding of it, except here, in connection with returning a lost object. When the temple was destroyed, may it be speedily rebuilt in our days. Now we announce it in our synagogues and in our study halls. Why here? Why is that added phrase, the prayer of the rebuilding, not in any of the other pieces of legislation? In all the other 14 places where the phrase is, didn't those rabbis who legislated, whatever they legislated, didn't they also pray for the rebuilding of Jerusalem? It sounds like a very, very subtle point, but I want you to listen carefully to the insight of Rabbi Yosef Engel. Rabbi Yosef Engel says that the Mitzvah of HaShovat Aveidah, of returning a lost object, can provide the merit by which the temple will be rebuilt. How is that possible? What's the connection? Returning a lost object, how is that more connected to rebuilding the temple over any other mitzvah, any other merit, any other action? The only place in the entire Talmud where we specifically invoke the prayer that it should be rebuilt with returning a lost object, what's the connection? So listen. Let's start with a passage in the Talmud totally unrelated to this. The Talmud, the tractate of Mako, says, Rav, one of the great Talmudic scholars, says, I am afraid of this verse in the Torah. The Torah says, Va'avadatem bagoyim, in describing the exile that the Jewish people will suffer, the exile that we ourselves are suffering. The Torah says, God says, Va'avadatem bagoyim, and you will be lost among the nations of the world. And Rav said, I am frightened by that verse, because that verse says to me that the Torah is predicting the final doom of the Jewish people, the end. It'll all be over, God forbid. Rav Papa said to him, don't be so depressed. Don't be so upset. When the Torah says, Va'avadatem bagoyim, and through the exile the Jewish people will be lost among the nations of the world, yes, it's very bad, but it's not the end. Because in exile, yes, we the Jewish people will be a lost object. Va'avadatem, the same word, aveidah, we will be a lost object. But we will be the kind of lost object that someone is looking for, that someone is trying to retrieve to its rightful owner. We will be the kind of lost object whose owner has not given up hope of getting his object back. God wants us back, and even if we are lost, we will be returned to our rightful owner, will be returned to God. Rabbi Yosef Engel says that if a person is meticulous in the mitzvah of HaShovat Aveidah, they are careful to go out of their way to try to, when they see a lost object, to return it to its owner. They create a merit as if it's a prayer to say to God, Master of the universe, I returned a lost object to its rightful owner. Isn't it time for you to find your lost object, the Jewish people, and bring them back to you? And that's why the only time in the entire Talmud, when the Talmud says, Mishachara Beis HaMikdash, when the temple will be destroyed, Sheyibana b'mheira b'yameinu, may it be rebuilt speedily in our days, because it is through the action of returning a lost object that we turn to God and pray that God should do the same with us. When we have the opportunity to return a lost object to its owner, we should think about what it means for our own moral character and for our own spiritual character. And we should also perform that action as a prayer to God to do the same mitzvah with us, the Jewish people, to return us to where we belong. My friends, I want to wish you a beautiful evening and a great Shabbos. And I look forward to seeing you all soon in person.